Dark Shadows, number 25, VTR 71566, airs 72966. Take one.
My name is Victoria Winters. The tension at Collinwood had almost made me forget the purpose for which I'd come. But now a letter has arrived. A letter that once again has raised the specter of my past. A letter that intrudes upon the present and heightens the growing fears of a 9-year-old boy.
David! What are you doing? What have you got there?
Nothing.
Hand it to me. Did you hear me? Did Miss Winters give you the permission to read this letter?
I didn't think she'd care.
I see. You didn't think she'd care. If you broke into her room and came here... David, come back here! David! David! What do you mean running out of a room while I'm talking to you? I have enough on my mind without having to cope with your nonsense.
I wasn't going to read her own letter.
David, I have something to explain to you. This letter is addressed to Miss Winters. It's private, and reading it without her permission is just the same as stealing.
Why don't you put me in jail?
Don't get fresh with me, young man.
That's what you'd like to do, isn't it?
David, I'm trying to explain something to you, and it has nothing to do with going to jail.
The person that made your car crash. You want to send him to jail, don't you?
We're talking about this letter. Now, why were you so anxious to read it?
Because.
That's not an answer. David, I'm waiting for an answer.
I thought there was something in it about me.
What makes you think that the Hammond Founding Home would write to Miss Winters about you?
Because you want to get rid of me. You tell them to send me away.
David, let's not go into that again.
You said you wanted to send me away, didn't you?
If you don't stop breaking into people's rooms and reading their mail, I may have no choice. Now, I want you to tell me that you'll never do it again.
What for? You wouldn't believe me anyway.
All right, David, get back to your schoolwork.
Hello? This is Mrs. Stoddard. Oh? I see. Well, are all the papers ready for signature? Fine, I'll tell him. Goodbye.
Mrs. Stoddard,
Is David finished with his lessons for today?
well, I wanted to talk to you about him.
I'm sure it can wait.
Ever since your brother's accident, he's been acting very strangely.
Well, naturally. His father was almost killed.
Well, what I mean is, when the sheriff was here, he seemed to think he was going to be arrested.
I can't worry about every fantasy of an imaginative boy.
But what if it's more than fantasy? Mrs. Stoddard, I don't know how to say this, but... Well, you and Mr. Collins both seem to think you know who tampered with your brakes.
Yes, Burke Dudley. The sheriff is probably with him right now.
But even the sheriff said you should try to think if there wasn't someone else who might want to kill your brother.
There is no one else.
Except my loving son, of course. That phone call, Liz, was it the sheriff?
No, it was the insurance people. What are you doing with Miss Winter's letter?
I rescued this from David. You know, you'd think that sheriff would have something to report by now.
Well, what did David want with
Oh,
it?
just foolishness, that's all. His latest is that he thinks I want to send him to jail. I'd keep this under lock and key if I were you, Miss Winters. That is, if it's important to you.
Well, hasn't Mrs. Stoddard spoken to you about it?
No.
I think we can have this discussion later.
But I wanted
Later, Miss Winters. Right now, I'd like you to go upstairs and finish David's lessons with him. Thank you very much.
I must admire you, Liz. You really have a neat way of managing people.
I hope I can do as well with you.
I thought you'd be studying.
I am.
All right, David. Let's get back to work. You were studying about the early history of Maine.
My father told you about the letter, didn't he?
I'd rather forget about it if you don't mind.
I knew he would. He just loves to get me in trouble.
David, nobody gets you in trouble but yourself.
I kind of knew you'd stick to his side.
We were talking about the first French settlement in Maine, I think.
Grown-ups always stick together.
David, I agree with your father when he's right. And I disagree with him when he's wrong, and that's the way it is.
What's so important about that letter, anyway?
Maybe it's just as important to me as those magazines are to you.
What magazine?
These. You learn a lot from them, don't you, David? How to fix things, break them, how to put things together and take them apart.
Well, sure.
David, why were you so afraid of the sheriff?
Who says?
You thought he'd come here to arrest you, didn't you?
Why should he? I didn't do anything.
Then why are you always talking about going to jail?
You're just like my father. You want to get me in trouble, too. Just because I read your stupid letter.
This has nothing to do with my letter.
I'll bet it was all about me. I bet you and my father planning to try and send me to that place.
David, the foundling home is only for children who don't have parents. Your father couldn't send you there even if he wanted to.
I don't believe it.
Let's get back to work.
Well, you don't believe me. Why should I believe you? I didn't have anything to do with my father's car.
I don't remember accusing you, David.
So that's what the famous letter was about.
That's right. Someone had a private detective make inquiries about Miss Winters.
What do you mean, somebody? I wish Burke Devlin.
Very likely.
Well, it should be easy enough to find out. All we have to do is give the sheriff the name of the detective, and they can check through New York.
I don't want him to know anything about it.
But that's ridiculous. It would prove that Burke didn't come back here just to be friends. And if he's trying to dig up information on a girl that you've engaged to be...
I don't want the sheriff or anyone else prying into our personal affairs.
Personal affairs. Burke tampers with the brakes on my car. I almost get killed, and you talk to me about personal affairs.
My mind is made up, Roger.
But that doesn't make sense, Liz.
From the day she walked into this house, Miss Winters has been wondering why I engaged her. Why I chose a girl I'd never heard of and brought her all the way up here from New York to help take care of your son. Well, I did my best to find an answer for her. And I'd hoped it was settled once and for all. But now I'm afraid it'll start all over again.
Well, what does that have to do with my accident?
Nothing. But that's precisely my point. My reasons for engaging Miss Winters have absolutely nothing to do with your accident. And I don't want any further questioning of them by you or the sheriff, and particularly not by Miss Winters.
You may be able to manage some people, Liz, but you can't control an entire world. If a private detective made inquiries about Miss Winters once, what's to prevent him from doing it again?
According to the letter, the detective was satisfied that he couldn't get any information from the foundling home. I'm not worried about him. It's the sheriff starts stirring things up.
Well, then what is bothering you?
Miss Winters. She's going to start prying again, wondering again, want answers again.
You think she's the only one, Liz? Don't you think I've been wondering about her?
I imagine you have.
Why did you reach out all the way from Collinsport to a foundling home in New York? Why did you suddenly decide to engage that girl?
Because she seemed to be well qualified to take care of David.
But how could you know this? You haven't been out of this house for 18 years. How could you know about a girl who was a total stranger when she first walked in here?
All I know is what you told me.
Me?
That's right, Roger. You recommended her to me. Did I say something amusing?
Oh, come on, Liz. I never heard of the girl until you told me she was on her way here.
Perhaps you've forgotten then.
Oh, now you're not making any sense. How could I forget something that I never knew?
I engaged Miss Winters because you told me someone at the foundling home told you she was excellent with children. That's what I've told her in the past, and that is what you're going to tell her.
I see.
She'll undoubtedly ask you the name of the person who recommended her. We'll have to prepare an answer for that she can't check on.
And what about my answer, Liz?
I've already told her.
You've told me hocus pocus, Liz. Now I want the truth. Why did you engage her?
That's a private matter.
Well, it must be pretty important for you to go to all this trouble.
I said it's private, Roger.
Sure it is, until some detective manages to dig up the truth. Liz, don't you understand? If it's important enough for Burke to try to find out about it, don't you think I have a right to know?
It has nothing to do with you.
Well, you want me to lie for you, don't you?
I asked you to tell Miss Winters a certain story. That's all I'm asking you to do.
What if I refuse?
You won't.
Don't be too sure, Liz. You think you rule my life.
Roger, you want to stay in this house. Either you do what I ask you to do, or you can pack your things and leave tomorrow.
Is it that important?
My reason for engaging Miss Winters is private. It will remain private. And I'll expect your cooperation in keeping it that way.
The important thing for you to remember, David, is that when the French left their colony at St. Croix Island, the English sent settlers in 1607 and they settled at the mouth of the Kennebec River. You remember the name of that settlement?
Fort St. George?
Very good.
Miss Winters?
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry I called you a liar.
Well, let's forget about that conversation, shall we?
I know if there was something in the letter about me, you would have said so.
I'd rather not talk about it if you don't mind.
It's just I don't want you to think I didn't believe you.
All right. Fine.
Just like I want you to believe me. I don't lie, Miss Winters. Really, I don't. I mean, I
hope I'm not interrupting you two.
Oh, no, we were just having a discussion about honesty.
Oh, in regard to playing with people's property that don't belong to you?
No, just in general.
I see. Miss Winters, do you still have that letter with you?
No, it's in my room. If you like, I'll get it.
No, I just want to discuss it with you. That is, if my son would give us permission for a while.
I think he'd be delighted.
Father? Did you hear from the sheriff yet?
Not yet? Why?
Well, I just wanted to know if he had arrested Mr. Devlin yet.
You couldn't be more anxious than me, David. Shall we go downstairs?
Fine.
My sister tells me that this letter has raised several questions in your mind.
That's true.
Specifically, you're wondering About someone who apparently has hired a lawyer, or a detective, rather, to find out why you were selected for this position. Is that right?
Yes.
You know, of course, Miss Winters, that we think Burke Devlin is behind these inquiries.
But why? What would he learn?
That's exactly the point. Nothing.
Then why should he bother?
Miss Winters, you know the situation here. You know that Burke Devlin's main interest in coming back to Collinsport was to harm me and my family. He would try to learn anything at all that might be damaging. Well, tampering with the brakes in my car, I assure you, was far more fruitful than prying into your past.
If he did tamper with them.
Of course he did, just as he hired a detective to find out all he could about you. Well, I certainly wouldn't have helped him with the bleeder valve, removing it from my car. But I could have told him everything he wanted to know about you.
You mean because you knew the person who recommended me for the job?
That's right.
Your sister told me about it my first day here. I mentioned it to you then. You must have forgotten about it.
Oh, I guess so.
Well, I haven't, Mr. Collins. I remember your reaction at the time. You acted as though you'd never heard of it before.
Well, I suppose I had something else in my mind.
Well, I suppose your sister must have had something else on her mind, too, when she told me that same story.
Why do you call it a story, as though it's not the truth?
I've checked with the Foundling Home, Mr. Collins. Perhaps you didn't know that. Just like that detective did. And I know that no one at the Foundling Home had ever heard of you or your sister.
Well, of course they hadn't.
But you just said that
I told you that you had been recommended to me. It's true, but not by anyone living in the Foundling Home. You know the home is supported by donations, don't you?
Yes.
And I'm sure you know that many of the donors prefer to remain anonymous.
Well, yes.
There's a woman in New York. When the problem arose, I can't tell you her name, but when the problem arose that we needed someone for David, I contacted her. Apparently, you had impressed her more than once.
Well, can't you tell me her name?
I'm afraid not.
But...
Excuse me. Hello. Oh, yes, Mr. Carter. Well, did you see Devlin? Well, of course he'd deny it. I told you that. Well, you didn't let it go at that, did you? Well, of course I expected you to arrest him. Why do you think I called you in on this? Look, Mr. Carter, I can't tell you how to run the police department in this town, but I don't intend to wait. I want something done. He didn't do a thing. All he did was talk to Devlin, that's all.
perhaps he saw no reason to arrest him.
No reason. I'm going to have a talk with that sheriff.
Mr. Collins, we're not through with our talk.
Miss Winters, forget about that letter. Tear it up, throw it away. Just forget about it.
David.
Where the Action Is made its debut 1 year ago with top recording stars performing Where the Fun Is. Come along for a real good time next here on ABC. Dark Shadows is a Dan Curtis production.